Hello everyone and welcome to the next Sitebulb live Q&A. This evening we have Cindy Crum, founder of Mobile Moxie, Colt Sleever, an SEO engineer from iPullRank, and of course myself and Patrick from Sitebulb. This evening or morning, depending on where you're at, we're going to be talking about mobile desktop parity and what that means for SEO. So I've got a pile of questions lined up and ready to go, but if you've got any to add, please do drop them into the live chat. If you add a queue on at the start of them, it makes it a bit easier to pull them out. We've got Simon on the live chat as well, so he's going to be keeping things in line a little bit and helping forward the questions to us. So hello, Simon, and thank you very much for that. Before we dive into the questions, I am going to ask our guests to introduce themselves. So Cindy and Colt, for anyone that doesn't already know you, could you let them know who you are, what you do, and what your connection with mobile and desktop parity is in your work day to day? Cindy, would you like to go first?
Sure. Okay, so my name is Cindy Crum. I'm the CEO of Mobile Moxie, and we have a mobile SEO toolset. And I've focused on mobile SEO almost since the beginning. I wrote a book about mobile marketing in 2010, and I've been focusing on mobile SEO since about 2005, before the iPhone was even out, before the App Store existed. I've always cared about mobile, so that's why I'm here, I suppose.
And my name is Colt Sleeva. I'm an SEO engineer at iPullRank. And what that means is that I am a very technical SEO who's committing code, which brings me into my relationship with mobile parity. And that would be that I help develop the Pareto tool that iPullRank put out that you can use to sort of compare contexts that we're going to be talking about.
Well, that's great. I think it's safe to say that you're both a lot more qualified for this Q&A than I am. It gets quite a technical subject at times. So to get things started, we thought we would squeeze a question in just to sort of set the scene a little bit and ask, what is mobile desktop parity? Because there might be a few people there that aren't quite clear what it actually is. So, Colt, I'm going to pick on you first off.
Sure.
Could you give a very sort of quick overview of what it is?
So the general idea is that when we develop websites, we have a set of tools that will let us define what it looks like for mobile or desktop. So this would be media queries or JavaScript. You can get screen size, and that allows you to adapt what you see. And in some cases, you get the exact same content on both, and sometimes you don't. So what we're looking for is parity, meaning that both sides are equal.
Yeah, no, that kind of sums it up quite nicely, I think. Is there anything to add there, Cindy?
No, I think you got it.
Got it in one.
I think the obvious extension to that then is why is it important for SEO? Because, I mean, it's one thing knowing what it is, but I think most of our audience are SEOs, so they need to know, well, why should I be bothered about this?
So I can jump in on this one. So mobile and desktop parity has been important ever since Google. Well, it's been important for a long time, but it's been officially important ever since Google launched mobile first indexing, where they're using the mobile version of the site to crawl and index. And their biggest concern was that many websites historically have limited the amount of content that they would put on the mobile version, assuming that mobile users don't want to read as much or don't want to see as much on a page. And so Google wanted to kind of turn that tide and say, hey, that's not the best practice anymore. We need you to have exactly the same content on desktop that you do on mobile, or on mobile that you do on desktop, and not limit or truncate what you're presenting to your mobile users. And so they made a big deal about it because if they're going to use a mobile first crawling and indexing scheme, if the content is not there in the mobile use case, then it might just not be known or understood or might be entirely missed. That was the premise.
Yeah, the highlight there is indexing for sure, because that is what Google is using for their entire algorithm. So if it doesn't get indexed, it's not in their cache, which means if that text that you had on desktop isn't on mobile as well, then they don't know about it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I suppose the next question we've got there, you touched upon slightly there, Cindy. So this question might be a little behind in a sense in terms of where are we in the rollout timeline. So as in shifting to mobile only. Am I right in saying we're already there?
Yes, we're there. You should have been doing this over a year ago.
There is a caveat, I think. You will see desktop crawls coming from Google. So it's not entirely mobile only. It's not 100%. But as of today, everything is extremely mobile first. And so this is a priority.
Well, and I'll add to your caveat in that Google has been a bit unclear about the communication as to the impact of mobile parity on desktop sites. So for instance, since the desktop crawler is still crawling, and if you don't have good mobile parity, does that drag down your desktop rankings or only your mobile rankings? And they've kind of waffled on this a little bit and not been super clear about it. What I parsed from what they're hinting at is that right now, mostly if you don't have parity and you have less content on mobile, you're going to suffer in mobile rankings more than desktop, or maybe to the exclusion of desktop. I haven't heard any specific communication on that point for a while. Has anyone heard anything other than that?
No, my general recommendation is to just do the right thing. Like, we know what the right thing is, so I don't necessarily want to like interpret. I just want to provide parity.
Yeah.
And that brings us up to Garrett's question, which we kind of answered.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I just saw that pop up, and we nicely segued into that.
Yeah, it feels we're not certain that Googlebot Desktop, like what job it's completely still doing. So we just try to target mobile first, like Google is targeting mobile first.
Yeah, exactly. And even if you personally believe that the desktop bot is still crawling and doing its job and backing up the mobile bot for indexing, that could switch off any day without any warning. And without any further warning, but we've been warned. They've told us that this is what's needed.
Yeah, it's clear to see where we're heading. I suppose the next one talks a little bit more about where we're heading. So Mike King put out a piece earlier in the year with this headline of mobile-only indexing would cause the biggest shake-up in 2021. Do you agree on this? Have we reached that point where the shake-up's come and gone, or is there still more to come, or is there things that are going to trump that?
I mean, Mike King is my boss, so yes. Yeah, whatever Mike said, it's right. No, but I think, so if we went to true mobile-only indexing, and this analysis came out of the yearly report that he did, where I think it was something like 20 to 30% of sites were actually showing mobile parity. I don't have the exact number right now, but if that did happen, then we would see a vast number of internal links and content being dropped. Additionally, just from my own experience as practicing SEO with clients, this is a regular issue that we're solving.
Yeah, I generally tend to agree with Mike as well. He's a super smart SEO. But I'm not sure, like, there's still a lot that could happen in 2021 that could be bigger. We're seeing a lot of Google playing with the way that search results are displayed in terms of site links and how they format the look and feel of certain queries versus other queries. So for instance, something where they are straight into the topic layer, like dog breeds are a good example. If you search for Labrador Retriever, you're going to get a left nav in your Google search result that looks different on desktop and changes the presentation on mobile. And it seems like that's where Google's wanting to go. And it seems like that's a more interactive scenario for their voice, the future of voice kinds of search and their assistant kinds of things, assistant interacted search. So I'm not sure it's the biggest, but it's certainly very big.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it seems like it's one of them things that people don't necessarily understand enough to see the risk there, so that it gets played down, whereas other topics get played up a little bit.
I'm really glad you mentioned voice, and I was hoping that you would, because it feels like an extension of mobile, where we went from desktop, basically widescreen, large amounts of information, down to phones, and then you see people are able to navigate to websites on like watches now with Apple's watches.
Yeah.
And so at this point, like, voice kind of feels like the next reduction.
Well, and as you probably know, Google has a voice-oriented crawler that it's sending out. It has a different name. It's not the mobile crawler. It's got a different name, and it follows different robots' text instructions. That makes it seem really unfair about how, it seems like it's intentionally confusing, but just know that the voice-only bot or the voice-oriented search bot is out there looking for stuff. And also, we've been training it with all of the speakable schema, FAQ, how-to, and Q&A. That's exactly what it's looking for to train its brain on how to respond to voice queries.
So do you think we could be find ourselves in position next year where we're having the same conversation but about voice parity rather than desktop and mobile?
Well, people tease every time anyone says it's the year of mobile or the year of voice or anything like that. And SEOs especially have been skeptical about voice for a long time. But I do think that voice queries are increasing, whether or not Google is reporting on it directly or not, right? They're lumping all that data in to make it hard to find. Or because maybe it's hard for them to parse out. I don't know. We don't know why they're not being more explicit about it. But if you just think about how you interact with the Internet of Things, perhaps in your own home, I know that I personally and most of my friends do yell at digital assistants to set an alarm or change the channel more than I did 2 years ago. Or play music or whatever.
And I think as well, like when you see the like younger generation coming through, like I've got kids 7 and 8, and they do know how to use the internet and stuff, but they're not sitting at desktop computers or laptops. They're on, can I borrow your phone, Dad? They're on the tablet, or they're shouting at Alexa. Like that is how they're interacting with the internet. They're not. It's just not the same. And as they grow older, as they go through and become the people that we're all targeting and trying to sell to, it will just be a totally different experience. It's got to be.
Well, and what's critical to a good user experience with a voice interaction or with a assistant interaction is that you almost don't feel that it's internet, right? It just feels like an answer that comes out of nowhere. Because you're not on a computer or you're not touching a screen or a mouse or a keyboard. And so it's kind of like this omnipresent knowledge that is not obviously internet. Just like, and in the same way that people who aren't especially technical don't understand that Facebook is the internet or Facebook is on the internet.
Yeah. That goes into Google's new MUM that sort of takes like, basically multi-query questions and is able to consolidate them down to a multi-part answer. So we're really heading in a direction where we can parse and summarize complex information and then drop it in as a single sentence.
If we just check, it looks like YouTube is saying there's a playback error. I've just got it open here.
Right, we've got.
I refreshed the page. It worked. Maybe it was just me. I just wanted, I don't want to waste all our great content and all these questions if it's not working. So, carry on.
Yeah. that kind of leads into another one from Garrett there. Is there any advantage in creating device-specific content versus depending on responsive content?
Yes. So mobile is slower, and if we know that a mobile device is requesting information, we can send less assets over. And so that's a key way to sort of improve your Crux Core Web Vitals scores.
Yeah, I can jump in though and say that I think that the effort that it takes to create separate pieces of content may be not necessary in the long term, perhaps. Because what I see happening in the near term, and what I think might be, also another thing that's bigger in 2021 and especially 2022 as well, is more of the edge SEO stuff, where intelligent decisions are being made in the cloud on an edge server in an edge cache, where it might just adapt and send the content without us having to necessarily create all of the different variations or different versions of a piece of content. The edge will detect how fast or slow the requesting device is and adapt things on the fly. That's the dream, isn't it?
Yeah, makes more sense. I mean, I think as well that there's one thing is what we should do, but there's another in practical terms being able to do this. And I mean, I see how far behind a lot of people are, even optimizing for desktop with images and things like that. I mean, we talk about the ideal world and the big sites and things, but there's still a large chunk of the internet's on a long way even from getting to that point. So I think, yeah, what you're saying there, and you would facilitate a lot more of that.
Just depending on responsive content is a good thing, though. We're like, as far as CSS goes, like Bootstrap has come a long way, and now it is using Flexbox or Grid, these new CSS features that we're getting. So there's way more opportunity to deliver content in a flexible way for any device, and that feels really good as a developer.
All right, so another one here from Matt Tutt. Would not having parity between mobile desktop versions have any kind of negative impact on SEO performance? That seems a bit of a vague one, and it depends.
I mean, I think it will. Google is saying it will. It'll especially hurt mobile search rankings. And it just depends on how different things are. And Google has said that the more different they are in terms of experience and what the user sees, especially if text or images or interaction is missing, the worse that piece of content will rank. We assume that that's mostly the worst it will rank in mobile. But again, we already touched on this. Google hasn't said definitively that it won't also drag down desktop results, and it absolutely could. Especially in terms of where Google wants to go with their algorithm, which is prioritizing positive and successful engagement over the other signals that Google's leaned on historically.
I just want to see the same key assets like images, the same text content extractable in the same way. So the same kind of H1 through H5 and all of the paragraph text I want to be the same. And then I want the internal link count to be the same and what they point to, right? Because then you're changing your internal link graph if that's different. So really, if you check those boxes, I don't necessarily see a problem if there's other differences.
Yeah, like if you are designing mobile first and you're going, right, this is the core content, this is exactly how we want mobile users to interact with the site. Okay, now let's have a look at desktop. Okay, well, all the core content's there. Well, we can add these extra couple of things. They don't need to be identical. That's not the point. It's exactly what you're saying, Carl. It's about the important things for SEO being the same, right?
Right.
It's almost perfect how that flowed into the next question there. Yeah, I mean, I think that there seems to be one of the things that people aren't sure about is whether their sites need to be identical. When we're talking about parity, whether you need to be considering exactly the same thing or what leeways there are. And I think that's something that what you were talking about there, Colt, about what elements we should be considering. That's really important. I suppose we've got another one here as well that maybe let us delve into that a little bit more. So you mentioned a few things there, Colt, that we should be looking at. Is there anything that you have in your mind, Cindy, that definitely needs to be the same? Is there anything beyond them elements, or as long as we've got them pinned down, we're fine?
Yeah, I think it's text and internal links, heading tags. And then sometimes I see people using JavaScript and not realizing how the JavaScript is impacting the mobile version of a page because they always test on the desktop version of the page. So they'll go to a view executed source or inspect element kind of thing, but only on desktop. And so sometimes your JavaScript or React Helmet or whatever you're using is overriding mobile only tags for things like schema, things like your title tag, your meta description, any of that. Make sure that those are also matching and present.
Yeah.
Can I ask as well, like kind of a follow on, like if you're doing this sort of work, like parity audits, are you at this point taking into account performance differences? So, in terms of load speed and stuff and core web vitals, or are you typically handling that stuff when tackling a performance-based audit? Like, do you bring this stuff in? Like if okay, well the contents are the same, but your speed, performance is awful on mobile. How does that fit in with your workflows?
I'm taking site speed pretty seriously, or I always have, mostly because I don't want to visit slow sites myself. And that's the start of it. But it only helped the issue when Google started pushing core web vitals for me. But there are definitely cases where you have a heavy asset like a video, and then we need to figure out how to optimize that video so that way it can land on the page, get some placeholder content in there while you then asynchronously load the video later. I definitely think about optimizing in front of this.
Okay.
Yeah. I tend to treat these two things differently. So load time, core web vitals, page experience, that's one thing, and parity is another. And they can obviously interact, and especially when you're looking at lazy loading and how you're handling that and how the bot is perceiving content as it's lazy loaded, that can change things a little bit. But yeah, to me, they're separate issues.
Awesome.
Yeah, we did actually have another question there about page speed insight variations. And sorry, my phone going off there. About page speed insights and the variation and whether that's involved in parity. But I think you've answered it quite well there already, Cindy. Going back to something mentioned a short while ago as well. So you talked a little bit about testing, Cindy. Do you have any particular methodology or tools or any of the above? I know you've actually got a couple of tools yourself, so obviously let us know about them.
Yeah, so Mobile Moxie has the Pagescope tool, which lets you see any website in any country, if the country's changing anything, on a bunch of different phones. Like, I think we have over 50. So you could test different size phones there just to see, especially if you don't want to test on your own phone or you want to test on a phone that's different from what you have, or in a different location than what you have or where you're at. But then if you want to get really detailed, what we do when we're being really detailed is we'll use web page test, because you can set it for desktop or mobile rendering, and then it gives you, it just gives you the count of everything. And so we just put those counts side by side, the number of images, the number of CSS, the number of JavaScript, things like that. And we don't panic if those numbers aren't the same, but we need to explain them. Right. And especially if they're wildly different, we want to understand why, or, which link is missing, which image is missing, stuff like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And is this becoming part of, well, I assume it is, but how big a degree is this become part of your day-to-day auditing of sites?
I would say it's common when we do big audits, when we're asked to go into the details and really be specific. When people just want to know, are we pretty good, or does this look? Do you see any concerns? We might do one or two major page templates, but not all the page templates. The ones. It really just depends, I guess.
Yeah. Cole, do you have a particular tool set that you use? Again, I know you've got your own tool there, so that's obviously going to fit in here.
Yes, thank you for that loaded question. Leading me right into Parito, which we had developed. And Mike King's hypothesis for this was that we needed to check as many contexts as possible for multiple URLs. And we needed to check multiple variables for that too. So each of the contexts would be mobile versus desktop. And then are you Googlebot or do you have a regular user agent? And then the other one is, do you have JavaScript turned on or not? And so by checking all of these sort of segments, you're able to verify what bytes are getting delivered. Do you have the same, what is the differences in the content? And sort of what changes through each of the contexts, and then you can run them at bulk as well to sort of layer in, let's say, different page types with different templates, or maybe yours versus a competitor to find some competitive problems.
Yeah, it's kind of like a crawler, sort of specifically for this exact parity question.
It's a big parallel crawler. It just shoots off a bunch of crawls all at the same time with the different contexts.
Yeah, and again, I suppose same question: is it becoming a standard part of the audits that you do these days?
Yeah, I check with every audit that I do. I'm almost always concerned about internal links up front. I want to make sure that the link graph is intact everywhere that you look. And then following that would be on-page content next. That sort of like descends from there in importance, and you'll see micro differences with almost any site you visit. It's actually very rare that a site has 100% context parity.
Yeah. And are you again, like Cindy mentioned before, are you picking like every single page template, or are you typically just going for the most important stuff? Or how if you've got a massive site, you can't check parity for absolutely every page, obviously. So how are you handling that?
You would be surprised at how large sites sometimes have 5-page templates.
Yeah.
It's actually, the complexity isn't necessarily by page template. So you can definitely tell, where one page template from another, and you end up with a set of maybe 5 to 10 URLs.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah. Just in terms of when people are scoping this out, it's not. It doesn't have to be the most enormous job possible to do this. Like you say, once you understand the different page templates, then you can do what you need to do with it, right?
That's usually. Oh, go ahead, Cindy.
Well, I was just agreeing and saying the main thing is knowing if any major aspect of navigation changes, and whenever there's a nav change, always testing that on mobile and desktop, just because it can be a bit. There are so many plugins and code that people use to do their navigation and to adapt it for mobile, that it can be a bit trickier to notice if you're not testing on mobile a lot.
That's a great point. Like having to take a mega menu down to a hamburger menu can be a big task that usually loses links in the process.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's one of the things that I've been quite surprised by recently since we brought in the render versus responsibility versus render report, of how many changes are going on there. I thought it was more edge cases than that beforehand, but there's a lot of serious things going on as well. So moving on from testing, is there a need for monitoring? Is this something you tend to find changes on a site over time? Or is it something that you can just do occasionally and it remains the same? What's your experience with the sites that you've looked at so far?
It depends. Are they actively making changes around this? Then we should continue to check it and observe it. But if it's once in a blue moon that they're actually making template changes, because this is usually a template level change, then you don't necessarily need to keep a constant monitor.
Yeah, I agree. I think the bigger the company is and the more spread out the development team and sprints are, and the less you have control over pages. Like if you get surprised when there's a homepage change, then absolutely you need to be monitoring this. But if you're brought in on every page template change or nav change, then maybe you don't. We end up working with companies that are so huge, like the SEO team gets surprised by changes sometimes that go live. And so that's when monitoring is really important.
Yeah. I'm actually jumping to a different question because it fits in nicely with that as well. In that, where's the line in responsibility between SEO and devs for this? There's something that keeps coming up with performance and all of the sort of technical issues. I know you're both a bit more technical than a lot of SEOs, so you're maybe going a bit further, but typically where would you see the line drawn from an SEO identifying issues to saying, right, now it's the dev's job?
I want to hear from Cindy first, I think.
Then I'm
going to shoot off her notes.
Devs.
I think of myself as quality assurance. And then I can hand off code if I need to. Like if we want to sort of smooth the process of what you actually want done, you can just hand off the code to them. But I want a good quality experience for Google, our users, and the developers as well. It's just, how can I smooth this process for everyone? And like other channels as well. SEO touches on almost every marketing channel at some point.
Yeah, I was mostly joking, saying blame the devs, but it's different in every company. How much of SEO validation is expected from a dev team versus not at all? That's kind of almost a job description culture thing. And so I know this as being a consultant. I've been in different companies where it's a lot on the devs and where the devs are not expected to even know what Googlebot is or does. So it really is company dependent. But I agree that as SEOs, part of our job is and always will be validating what the development team does. Hopefully before it goes live, but definitely also after it goes live.
Yeah, it would be nice if we always got to see it. Right, I'm going to dive into the chat and pull out a couple of questions now. So I've got one from Simon. Is mobile parity driving the adoption of headless CMSs?
No.
No?
Headless CMSs are happening by themselves. People love working with React and Vue. It's a pretty smooth experience. I would say that there's a whole community around JavaScript, as larger perhaps than our SEO community. And that is not informed by us.
Yeah, the mobile parity thing is just gravy for other good stuff that comes with the headless CMS.
I suppose, yeah, we SEOs tend to be a bit inconsequential when it comes to the big decisions a lot of the time, unfortunately. But yeah, so we have the one from Patrick from earlier on that I missed as well. What are the biggest mobile desktop parity issues you've seen, and did fixing them make a big difference? I suspect this will be a big
I
one
wanted
for a
like the
lot of
nightmares. I wanted like the worst, the worst stuff. I didn't put the word nightmares. That's what I meant.
Most of the issues that I've seen have been more JavaScript parity rather than mobile parity. People are sending generally the same content with dynamic CSS, or with responsive CSS. But the JavaScript issue is a big deal for organizations who are generating content from client-side JavaScript.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing about what we do as SEOs right now, and the hardest thing to get SEOs to update in their behavior for testing, is the idea that the JavaScript parity is important, but could be different or occur differently for different devices, right? So if you have JavaScript that's adapting things specifically for mobile, they might have kind of left other stuff in that overwrites title tags or heading tags or schema, or just deletes it or pulls out the href lang. I've definitely seen all of that happen where it was only broken on the mobile version of the rendered source, and not, or even unrendered, when we were worried, for a while when there were the two passes and they were kind of a week apart, we worried a lot about what did they get first and what did they get second. Now it's faster, but we still worry a lot about making sure that any operation that happens either in the edge, in the cloud, that's populating stuff, or just via JavaScript elsewhere, is doing it to mobile and desktop.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. That just reminded me of something. Google is using CSS for certain things like heading tags. If it looks like a heading tag, if it's styled like one, they're going to treat it like one. Additionally, if you've hidden content with CSS on mobile because, let's say, it took up too much vertical space, then that's considered hidden. So we care about visible content as well, and just, sometimes you can send it and they'll pick it up if they're scraping it just through client side, but if they're doing any kind of rendering, it's ignored.
And just like this, so the second part of that question is, identifying these things and fixing them. Are you noticing then enormous shifts in the key metrics that you're tracking for these customers, or not, when you're actually solving these problems?
We've seen a big shift from recovering internal links that were not crawlable based on parity.
Yeah.
There has been entire sections of sites which just weren't discovered because the links that they assumed, were functional were not, for various reasons.
Yeah.
Usually JavaScript, but
it's almost as if the issue is your understanding of what is the truth. What is the true version of the site that Google's seeing? And when you look at it through one lens, you think this is it. You think this is my site. You think this is my links, but it's just wrong, right? It's not actually the case at all.
But I think this is
go ahead.
Going to grow, where it's going to be harder and harder to know what is actually being sent as more and more operations get put into the edge, and if it's not locked down, right? So I could be adding things, modifying redirects or modifying href lang at the edge level, and then the developer writes something that overwrites that, right? And they're all in the edge, and so you only know when it's being spit out to whatever scenario it was written for.
Yeah. It gets worse because Google relies on Chrome, right? Chromium, but there is also Firefox, the Gecko renderer, right? There's different rendering engines for the web that are handling things differently. So if your HTML is not semantically correct, different renderers are going to render things differently. So not just what is the edge sending down, or how big is your screen, but also what browser are you using, what user agent are you sending back. These are all potential views where something could look different.
Yeah, and there is no right. There is no, and like how you, I mean, we come across this problem quite a lot with Sitebulb when we're trying to say this is something you should look at. It's very difficult for a bot, a machine basically to say, well, this is the right thing or this is the wrong thing. Well, we can see these things are different, but we don't know which is right. Like someone here needs to make a decision about which is right and in which scenario it's right. Because we can't do it for you, and I guess it's the value of the SEO, right? In all of this is to understand from the user's perspective, from the developer's perspective, and be that sort of mediation point and the point of understanding to make sense of it all.
One of Sitebulb's key pieces is how do we make a bot that functions just like Google would?
Mm-hmm.
How does our bot function like Googlebot?
Yeah.
And that by itself is a hard problem to solve.
Yeah, tell us about it.
I'm going to throw one other little idea into the mix, and that is the importance of Core Web Vitals, not from an SEO and ranking perspective, but from a crawling and indexing perspective. The reason Google cares about Core Web Vitals is not only because it's good for the users, it's because it's good for them, and it makes their crawler more efficient. If you can render a stable page quickly, then they can render it too when they're crawling and indexing. And so that makes their job more efficient, saves them money and data center time and crawler time in the long run. They're not doing this only because it's good for the users. They're doing it because it's good for their ability to crawl and index the web quickly. And so what's going to happen over time is the reason you want good Core Web Vitals is because if you have bad Core Web Vitals, your page is going to be rendered wrong. And that's going to have consequences that are hard to predict, right? The best way to predict them is like, let's say you have a really slow page and you look at it in Search Console in the URL inspection tool, and you're like, hey, how come they didn't get my CSS? Because it ran out of time, because the crawl timed out, right? It took a picture before everything had loaded because it had to move on because your stuff is too slow. And so a lot of people will, say, oh, well, I'm getting different feedback from the mobile first indexing tool versus URL inspection tool versus, lists from Search Console about what URLs are problematic and what aren't. And it's all because of the time it takes to render. Really slows the bot down. And so it can give you different experiences in the different tools, and it can make them mismatch if it's slow today but was good yesterday, and things like that. So have you guys encountered this? You guys are looking at me like I'm crazy. It's absolutely
No, I am on board with that conspiracy that Google took the average website and then shifted it over 25% and said, we want everyone's websites to be faster than the top 75th percentile, right? So that's by itself going to save them millions of dollars from compute time spending on crawling. And they don't necessarily want to sit there and wait for you to load all of your assets. I had another point to that, but I forgot.
Yeah, we've absolutely seen this, and I believe your conspiracy theory, Cindy. Like, you can, if you weren't convincing of this, take a site, put it through Sitebulb with the HTML crawler, and watch your task manager compute resources. Watch the CPU and watch the RAM. Then do the same thing and run it through the Chrome crawler, which is headless Chromium, like the same thing that Google are using to render pages, and you'll see how much higher the CPU and the RAM.
It's expensive and slow.
It's much more expensive. It's why all the the SaaS crawlers need to charge a lot of money for this for rendering. And it's, from our perspective, it's kind of like a competitive advantage because we can do it using your own machine, to use these resources. But it just shows you the difference between crawling the old way they used to do it and now when they have to render it all the time. And I totally agree with the narrative that Google came along and said, well, how can we encourage website owners to make this an easier job that costs less resources. Yeah, and if we can get SEOs to beat the drum about core web vitals, they're going to go and do the job for us. They're gonna get some get some attention for us and help improve the situation. And if the net benefit is also good for users, then everybody wins. So it's not a bad thing. It's just I can certainly see why they would want to do it for sure.
Well, and I think that feeds into something that I've been saying for a long time, that I think we're going to see more and more, and that is the importance of, or the value to Google and users for things like service workers, where you can tag specific assets to say this doesn't change a lot and this does, and that creates an API that makes it easy for Google to create its own kind of smart cache of web assets to know when to fetch things new and when not to, where it's kind of got an API directly to your site, and it's got the framework of what it needs, so it doesn't have to rethink rendering every single time. It can kind of cache the rendering understanding from the service worker, and then just go fetch the important things that change and the text and stuff like that. That's the long-term benefit, but we have this middle ground where we have to use real hard process rendering, right? Where they have to brute force it, but I don't think that's the long term, or it's not the only scenario for the long term.
So if you follow the narrative, this is somewhat related. If you follow the narrative of Lighthouse and that tool, it started out as a research project to figure out could they emulate mobile devices and how slow they are. And what they found was that it was plus or minus 25% correct. And so they ended up using real people's browsers for the crux data that they just accumulate and merge together. And that is the actual crux value. So that way they don't have to do this browser rendering. They put the impetus on the rest of the people using Chrome rather than doing it themselves.
Yeah.
So they don't want to have to do this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally. Because doing all that stuff is even more intensive than just rendering in the first place. Actually figuring out if it's fast or not.
They just did it because they had to, because they had no better plan. I think that's my theory, is that they're doing the rendering. It's expensive. They don't love it. Crawling just text without JavaScript was much more efficient. So this is I think, yeah, it might not be the long-term solution, and it might be at least a stopgap solution when we look back on this 10 years from now.
Well, we'll schedule a webinar 10 years today.
Set a reminder.
We'll be right.
I hope I'm not having to deal with this in 10 years. Right, we are approaching the end, so I'm going to try and grab a couple of quick ones from the chat. So, Garrett, it's almost as if he's been a plant with all these good questions. Are there any industries that are more likely to have issues with device parity? Is it typically more complex for e-commerce, for instance?
I would say not necessarily an industry, but the size of the company is going to introduce more problems on accident.
Yeah, the number of platforms that you're sewing together.
Yeah. Correct.
I suppose the number of templates as well, like if we're talking about them being template based.
Yeah.
So.
And the number of different dev teams that have got hands in different sections of the site, right?
Right, and there's usually not cross-team communication that is sort of covering this correctly, which is why the SEO has to operate outside of that as a quality assurance platform.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've tidied most of the ones up in the chat now, so I'm going to drop in a last one from me. So, is there a top issue to watch out for? I know you've kind of answered this already. In the links seems to be one that kept coming back. Is there another one that people need to watch out for?
I would rather everyone take away today that links are important to me than to give you another one. Please make sure that all of your links are crawlable.
Yeah, links and hidden text maybe. if it's closed up in a expander.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
I would say the
That's
CSS
really-
hidden is an issue.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that kind of occurred to me in my head now. The more we've talked about, the more that it does come back to a core set of elements. It's not an infinite amount of things we need to be looking at. It's quite a closed group there, which should make it a little easier, hopefully. Right, so that kind of bringing us towards the end. So one thing I wanted to squeeze in before the end that we've been working on that I wanted to tell everyone about. We've been working on this campaign for a little while now for climate positive SEO auditing. Something been doing a bit of promotion. We've tried to get in front of people. Basically, we are trying to do a bit of good for the environment and offset the carbon footprint of the people using our tool. So we're doing that for our existing customers, and we're planting trees for all free trials and trees for newsletter sign up. So if any of the people watching have a chance, please have a look at the page I put up there and see if you can help us out by sharing it or sign up for the newsletter or whatever it is.
I love this so much. Thank you for doing this, because crawling, it's resource intensive, like we were just talking about, and I'd love to see that you're trying to offset that.
I'm glad we got some good feedback.
Yeah, we first came across this idea because Martin McDonald, I think he was tweeting about it.
Threadripper 6,000.
He's got millions of Threadrippers, and he's constantly running Sitebot at 4,000 miles an hour. And he's like, "Shit, what is the carbon footprint of all this?" And it did make us think. Actually, we could do something about this. And then the other side that you didn't mention there, Jeff, is that like part of the reason we're doing all this is because we've kind of realized that there's some responsibility we can take. So if anyone else can jump on board and think, yeah, we can make our own company climate positive as well, then if that's the output of this, then that's great as well.
Yeah, definitely. And that's actually something I need to write up. We've been talking about is just different ways that we've found that other people can be doing this as well. So take it a bit further, and we're looking to try and get agencies involved in things. So keep an eye out for that. Then, of course, thank you very much, Cindy and Colt, for joining us tonight. I found it really useful, so I'm sure everyone else will.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Is there anywhere where people should be following you? Twitter, I assume, is the usual. Anywhere else?
Twitter.
Twitter's where it's at. I don't like to go on LinkedIn. That's a scary place for me.
One knows. No one knows. Well, thank you again for joining us. Thank you for everyone for watching us. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel before you leave, and we'll be doing more of these and hopefully have as good a guest next time. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and good night.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.